It's E3 2017 and BioWare is preparing to reveal their brand new game, Anthem, a game that they thought would be talked about years after its launch. And when that trailer finally dropped, it was unlike anything we'd seen before. Iron Man-esque flying in a vast but gorgeous open world. Millions of people were collectively impressed by BioWare's new IP. There was one problem though. This game that was shown off didn't exist, and it wasn't even remotely close to existing. BioWare had hastily put this demo together with sticks, superglue and a prayer without having made anything concrete behind the scenes. The catch being that this game had to be released in less than 2 years after the E3 showcase. In a way, BioWare did succeed. Anthem is being talked about years after its launch, just not in a way that anybody wanted. By the time you're watching this video, Anthem will be officially dead. Its servers shut down on January 12, 2026, and without any single-player component, it is literally impossible to play this game even if you own it. So what better time to go through its history, with its rocky development, its disappointing launch, and the unsuccessful attempt made to save it. This is the story of the self-destruction of Anthem. Before we talk about Anthem itself, we need to set the stage. Our two protagonists are BioWare as well as its owner and publisher, EA. BioWare, and as much as it pains me to use this tense, was a prolific role-playing video game developer, having created titles like the original Baldur's Gate, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, the Dragon Age franchise, and of course, Mass Effect. EA, on the other hand, is this small little indie company who is behind niche titles like FIFA, Madden, and asking you to grind 40 hours to unlock Darth Vader in a Star Wars game in order to attain a sense of pride and accomplishment. Our story begins in 2012 when Casey Hudson, director of the Mass Effect trilogy, pitched an idea to top EA executives about a brand new game code-named Dylan. Named after Bob Dylan, Hudson aimed for this game to be talked about long after its release. It would be a multiplayer game, include survival elements, as well as a revolutionary new style of storytelling. What was that style? We'll figure that out later. While all of this was important, I think the key thing that the EA executives took away from this pitch, according to Anthem's executive producer Mark Dara, was that this would be a BioWare game that would do FIFA numbers. Keep in mind that this is the same time period that EA's then CEO was saying that they don't want single-player games and that they won't publish a game unless it has some form of online component. And sure, BioWare's games were critically acclaimed and sold well enough, but what if they could get a BioWare game that became a billion-dollar franchise? So this pitch went down really well with EA executives, and Project Dylan was immediately greenlit. Most of BioWare was working on Dragon Age Inquisition and Mass Effect Andromeda, so Hudson and a very small group of devs started trying to figure out what exactly Dylan was going to be. According to Jason Schreier's expose released years later, Anthem was originally meant to have survival mechanics and dynamic weather events on a hostile alien planet. So you'd be out in the open world, and suddenly there'd be a big storm and you'd have to find a way to survive. They also played around a lot with traversal mechanics. Hudson's team played around with climbing, gliding, and even flying without reaching a conclusive result. And that would become a bit of a theme in Anthem's development. A lot of ideas that sounded cool on paper couldn't be implemented either due to technical limitations or simply due to not being able to execute them well enough. So for example, dynamic weather sounds interesting, but how are you going to implement this in a game where millions of people are going to be playing it in shared lobbies? Things would take a turn for the worse in 2014 as Casey Hudson departed BioWare. We can only assume as to why that happened, but alongside him, he took this revolutionary new method of storytelling. We don't know if it ever existed, but if it did, he definitely didn't share it with anybody else at BioWare. Still, morale among the few people that were working on the game was very high. Not necessarily because things were going well, but because of the game's sky-high potential. There was even a teaser for the game in E3 2014. And with Dragon Age Inquisition releasing in that same year, more people were allocated to the Anthem team, although most of BioWare was still focused on Andromeda. Casey Hudson's departure was a massive loss for the studio. He was the one with the vision, he was the driving force behind this project, and his departure was felt heavily in the coming years. Hudson was replaced by practically no one, and decisions for Anthem were being made by committee. The problem being that the committee couldn't agree on anything. Flying was added, then removed, then re-added multiple times, levels were being built with a lot of verticality by one department and then another department would come in and flatten them out, and nobody could agree on what direction the game's story should take. Meetings would happen about how they should move forward with a certain part of the project, no conclusion could be reached, and then they would delay finding the solution for another time. In my video covering the Kojima-Konami debacle, there were some comments that didn't understand why Kojima himself received so much praise for his work, despite his games having hundreds of talented people working on them. Well, this is what the director does. They make decisions. Good or bad, it doesn't matter, the buck stops with them. And with Hudson's departure, the team working on Anthem were left without a leader. In turn, nobody really knew what they were making. To exacerbate things, Frostbite, the in-house engine they were making Anthem on, was terrible. From everything I've read about it, the Frostbite engine is described as something that's a tier below the Spawn of Satan. It was sluggish, couldn't do basic things, and to top it all off, they didn't use Inquisition's or Andromeda's infrastructure when making Anthem. Since this was a multiplayer game, they decided to basically build it from scratch. So not only did this game lack a coherent vision, but it was also very hard to work on. And if that wasn't enough, a lot of the BioWare developers that were experienced with Frostbite were assigned to help with FIFA's transition to the engine. Despite everything, what slowly started to take shape was a mixture between Borderlands and mainly Destiny. But it was considered taboo to even mention Destiny and was frowned upon by the game's leadership. So that made it even harder to work on the game, as the team wasn't allowed to look at what other competitors did. As Dara explains it in his post-mortem of the game, the issue with this is that if you're not allowed to see what others are doing, you can't find solutions to the problems you are having. I'm sure the people working on Anthem got around this somehow, but I wonder how they did it. Did they say the idea came to them in a dream? With 2017 rolling around, it was Mass Effect Andromeda's turn to launch. It was a complete dumpster fire. It was buggy, unfinished, and even when fixed, it was a complete downgrade when compared to the original trilogy. This very well may have strengthened EA's negative opinion on single-player games. But hey, they still had Anthem, right? With Andromeda's launch, all hands could finally be on Anthem's deck. But before we can get to the now infamous E3 trailer, there was one more problem. According to Mark Dara, sometime before the E3 demo, the team that was working on Anthem told upper management that the game would include 6 different types of javelins. Javelins being the Iron Man shoes you use in the game. EA really liked that number, however, the team later realized that they could only do 4 javelins. And you might be thinking, where's the problem? It was never advertised, were 2 javelins really that big of a difference maker? Well, to EA they were, and Dara believes that this played a big role in EA changing the leadership at BioWare. But before that could take place, BioWare still had to make the E3 demo. To a game, may I remind you that they still had no idea what it was going to be. On Christmas of 2016, leading to 2017, BioWare made a boots-on-the-ground demo for the game. This was at a point where flying had been cut once again from Anthem, but when very high-ranking EA executive Patrick Soderlund played it, he was very disappointed. A BioWare developer quoted him saying that this isn't what you promised me, and that he was especially displeased with Anthem's graphics. BioWare took 6 weeks and came back with a second demo, this time with a special emphasis on graphics and a last-minute decision to re-add flying in order to impress Soderlund. And impress him it did. According to Jason Schreier, Soderlund was very happy with Anthem's second demo. This would work as the basis for the demo that was shown off at E3. But wait, I'm sorry, did I say Anthem? I meant to say Beyond because that was the game's working name in the lead up to all this. And it makes sense, you go beyond the city to explore. Now, this is gonna get slightly nerdy, as if the rest of the video wasn't, because as it turns out, David Cage's Beyond Two Souls isn't actually called Beyond Two Souls. It's called Beyond, Two Souls, which granted Sony the trademark rights to the word Beyond. And when EA asked them to use the word, Sony rejected them. This, mind you, all being done days before the E3 reveal. There were even beyond t-shirts that were being printed out for the staff. So at the last possible minute, they went with Anthem. It meant nothing, but they later retconned it to mean something in the game's universe. As we discussed in the intro of the video, the E3 reveal went down really well. It was in that wonderful era where companies were trying to replicate gamers talking to each other, so we either got light military talk,
I'll go low, you flank,
or actors talking in the most unnatural way possible.
Have you been in there yet?
I haven't. We should do that later with Kim.
Yeah, you could use the XP.
There were some alarm bells ringing over this game being live service, but generally I think most people got excited over this. And how could you not? I mean, look at it. Iron Man flying in gorgeous environments? Sign me up. As people were finding out about the game for the first time, so were BioWare's developers. A lot of them found out in real time that this was the direction the game would take. I loved Mark Dara's take on this. He said that despite the demo being fake, it at least forced the team to pick a direction. For better or worse, this was the game they were going to make now, and they had around 20 months to do it. E3 was in June of 2017, and by that year's October, things were not going well. The team had managed to make only one mission, and they didn't even really like it that much. This, alongside presumably the Javelin debacle, led to EA changing BioWare's management. Casey Hudson made his return to the company not as Anthem's director, but as BioWare's general manager. One of his first courses of action was to bring Mark Dara, basically scratching and clawing from his work on what would much later become Dragon Age: The Veilguard, and installed him as the game's executive producer. As Jason Schreier very sharply points out, it's very telling that for a game that was in development for 7 years, its top billing went to a person that worked on it for 16 months. Dara's job was to get decisions made. The game needed to ship. But wait a minute, what happened with the Javelins? Did they get to 6? Well, no. The game's new management actually talked themselves out of making 6 Javelins. They did that by telling EA that if you really think about it, the game would have 8 Javelins because each Javelin would have 2 subclasses. That somehow worked, and on they went with Anthem's development. I think this is a great time to talk about BioWare Magic. BioWare Magic is the belief within BioWare that no matter how dire or chaotic a situation might look like, it's all going to work out in the end. It worked with the Mass Effect trilogy, it worked with Inquisition, and while it may not have worked with Andromeda, every rule has its exception. And while morale was dropping, there still was the belief that things were going to eventually work out. But as time passed, the crunch increased, deadlines got tighter, and this belief got replaced by stress. Jason Schreier reports people going to private rooms to cry, or even what was called stress casualties, where people were having mental breakdowns so big that they left the company for months, with some never returning. A lot of people left BioWare during that time, and judging by its most recent production, the company hasn't looked the same since. Close to the game's launch, BioWare realized that they hadn't tested the game's economy in a full playthrough. So they had QA testers play this non-stop and continual 8-hour shifts. One tester would play it for 8 hours straight, and then another one would pick up right where they left off for another 8 hours, with a third one completing the 24-hour cycle. The game's development was undeniably difficult, but hey, the public doesn't know about that. They just need to play what's in front of them. Maybe this was still salvageable. Maybe BioWare Magic could still save the day. Internal mock reviews came in for Anthem, and they were around the 70s. EA was fine with that. Maybe they had done it. As I've talked about it in other videos, when trying to enter the live service space, your game needs to be excellent. Because not only are you asking for people to pay full price for a game and then grind it for hours on end, you're asking them to change their gaming habits. You're asking them to stop playing FIFA, stop playing Destiny, stop playing Fortnite, stop playing so many other games to come play your game. Anthem was projected to have a Metacritic score in the 70s, which was already low for what they were trying to achieve, but the reality was somehow a lot worse. On February 22nd, 2019, Anthem finally launched, and it was a mess. It was full of bugs and glitches, and even without them, it was mediocre at best. It originally received a Metacritic score of 55, which has been bumped up to a 59 by the time of writing. Critics and fans liked the flying and shooting, and disliked pretty much everything else. It didn't have enough content, the content that was there wasn't diverse enough, and the story was uninteresting. Now, in my Concord video, I expressed my disappointment in not being able to play it. Well, lucky me, because I was able to play through Anthem in its entirety. And yeah, it's very bland. From the moment you boot it up, it looks like a Destiny clone. The inventory, the loot, even the game's lore. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Expedition 33, for example, lifts a lot of Persona stylistic choices. But where Expedition 33 uses this as a jumping point to do its own thing, Anthem wallows in its Destiny inspiration. In a lot of ways, it plays and feels like an inferior version of Destiny, especially its story. From the start, you get bombarded with in-game jargon like Zenotaph and the Anthem of Creation, but there's no hook that made me care about all this. You just play a mission, watch another person die, and then you're told to go do other missions. Eventually, you find out that there's a big bad villain doing big bad things, but it feels so generic, especially coming from BioWare. It doesn't help that most of the story is delivered either through stilted cutscenes or radio dialogue that you're not really paying attention to. The final boss fight is really cool though, I'll give it that. And the story was a big point of contention during the game's development. They weren't sure how to handle multiple people participating in the story, especially since the game encourages multiple playthroughs of the same mission. But the way they eventually handled it left everybody dissatisfied. And here's an unpopular opinion, I didn't love the flying. Yeah, it feels good, and flying underwater or through tunnels is especially fun, but once the initial sign wears off, it just feels a lot like holding left stick forwards and waiting. And the shooting, it's fine, it does the job, not anything exceptional. But what really annoyed me was the blatant padding the game has. We know that they didn't have a lot of time to add content, so in order to make people quote unquote get their money's worth, BioWare added mandatory grinding objectives. You're tasked to do the challenges of the Legionnaires. Luckily for you, the Legionnaires require you to kill 50 enemies with your melee attack, find 15 chests, and any other boring thing that can be done in the open world. Since I also want the video to be longer, why not consider subscribing? It would really help the channel out. That was an exciting 10 seconds, wasn't it? This is by far the low point of the game. According to Jason Schreier, initially the thought was to time gate these challenges so that you would be only able to complete them after a certain amount of real life days, but mercifully BioWare decided against it. In his post-mortem of Anthem, Mark Dara emphasizes how he insisted on adding more endgame content, that he knew that they would need to create a lot of it since players would consume it very quickly. But I found that regardless of the amount of endgame content, I didn't want to play it. I didn't care about the story or the world, the loot felt insignificant, and the gameplay, which is Anthem's strongest feature, was alright at best. After I beat it, I just wanted to move on. Anthem sold around 5 million copies. While this sounds good at first glance, it severely underperformed when compared to almost every other EA release at the time. Even when not compared to other titles, it definitely didn't live up to EA's lofty expectations. But while Anthem's launch didn't go down well, there still was hope for salvaging something out of this situation. A roadmap was released for all the content coming to the game that would be split in 3 different acts. But when Act 1 content started to drop, their reaction was lukewarm. Not enough people cared to make a significant impact on the game. So, a difficult decision was made. Acts 2 and 3 were cancelled, Anthem was put on life support, and work began on Anthem Next, a massive patch that would revive the game. However, there was a catch. Mark Dara did a great job in explaining this. When Anthem was shipped, most of BioWare moved on to developing the next Dragon Age. Only a small team was left behind to work on Anthem Next. In contrast to other big profile launch disasters like Battlefield 4 or Cyberpunk, these studios were only working on that game and could continue to work on it for as long as they needed. Anthem didn't have that same luxury. Then COVID hit, and that was pretty much all she wrote for Anthem. On February 24th, 2021, almost 2 years to the day of Anthem's launch, it was announced that Anthem Next was cancelled and that Anthem would remain online, but it would receive no further updates. According to Bloomberg, COVID wasn't the only reason Anthem Next was cancelled. The same year as Anthem failed, it was Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order that became a big success for EA, a single-player game. Apparently, Fallen Order's success played an important role in EA's CEO pulling the plug on Anthem. How poetic. And that brings us to today. Anthem is dead. You know, it would be easy to just put all of the blame on EA and move on, but it just looks like a mixture of everything going wrong at the same time. Casey Hudson leaving, the lack of a decision maker, the engine, BioWare's culture, the crunch, and of course, the external pressure from EA made for a perfect cocktail of disappointment. What is definitely EA's fault was pushing for the game to be launched when it did. Mark Dara describes getting a call from an EA executive that told him that if the game isn't out by Q1 of 2019, that the executive would be out of a job. And Dara, fairly logically, took this as an implied threat that he would be taken down with him. But I can also understand EA's perspective, where BioWare pitched something in 2012 and then virtually zero progress was made on that pitch for 5 years. It didn't matter to them that the person that actually made the pitch was long gone. What a story. You know, I'd say that maybe the industry learned its lesson. Maybe Anthem was the wake-up call it needed to stop putting all of its eggs in the live service basket. But even after Anthem's launch, we had many other high-profile failures like Babylon's Fall, like Marvel's Avengers, and of course, Concord. The company that did seem to learn its lesson was surprisingly EA. It increased its output of single-player games and even allowed them to not have the live service elements. It's a very low bar to clear, so low that it's approaching the Earth score, but a bar nonetheless. I say this and then EA blamed Veilguard's failure on it not having live service elements, despite Anthem failing in part due to its live service elements. I guess it's EA's way of showing they haven't completely lost their minds. In another timeline, Anthem could have been the single-player Iron Man game we always wanted. And even today, it could serve as the groundwork for a great game. It did have some interesting ideas, but unfortunately, I don't think there'll be another company that will give it the proper development time and budget. And now, you can't even play the idea. Thank you for watching this video. I'll be leaving a link both for Jason Schreier's Anthem expose, as well as Mark Dara's 4-hour 3-part post-mortem on Anthem. They were the two main sources I used for the video, and if you want a full breakdown of every single thing that went wrong with the game's development, that's where you need to go. If you want to watch a video about a game that also shut down its servers but only after 2 weeks, you can click here to watch Concord's $400 million disaster. See you in the next one.